This is the 10-Minute Contrarian Podcast. This is VP. We are a solutions-based podcast diving into the world of contrarian investing and alternative finance. You can find us hosted on the No Nonsense Forex YouTube channel, NoNonsenseForex.com, and podcast players everywhere. Episode 161 is brought to us by Bybit. Guess what? Another promotion. I remember when I first signed up for JetBlue's Miles Reward Program, which is stupid. I never take JetBlue. But I probably filled out like 30 of these long-ass surveys that they would send out every once in a while. And at the end of the day, I looked and saw how much miles I got from that, and it was about $6 worth of airline miles. So this is the opposite of that. If you're with Bybit right now, go to your portal. You can see this. They give you a handful of very easy social quests, and if you do that, you qualify, and 4,000 people will win a simple airdrop of $25 USDT. Now, this isn't the biggest promotion or giveaway they've ever had, but that's a heck of a ratio, and this goes from now until July 31st. And if you're jealous you're not on board, you need to get on board. Click the link down below that takes you to the blog. The affiliate link is at the bottom of that blog. Stop trading on platforms that don't give you anything. Trade with Bybit, because with Bybit, membership has its rewards. It is the 10-Minute Contrarian Podcast, and I promise you this is not and will never turn into a political podcast. We had a somewhat political-heavy episode 2 weeks ago, and I'm going to talk about it briefly here, but only to prove my point, and how it illustrates the overall theme of episode 161. And hopefully after these last few more holistic episodes, we will be getting back to, drilling down into the meat and potatoes of the things that we like to invest in. And those who have been with me long enough know that this is just how the podcast goes. We go through these little themes that take, 2, 3, 4 episodes to go over. Most people seem to enjoy it. A few people complain, but I always tell those people, look, this is not going to be the way. It's only temporary. And I think this is a perfect segue into this episode. So what the hell am I talking about? Well, if you're listening to this episode in the future, here's what's been going on this past week or so. So there was an assassination attempt on former President Trump. This actually gave him a lot of positive sentiment, while the sentiment on President Biden continued to deteriorate. And now everybody on the right is celebrating because President Trump is almost assured victory in the 2024 election. Democrats are panicking. Republicans are celebrating. Now, you guys know where I stand. I lean right on the political spectrum in the United States. I used to be more to the center, but the left has pushed me over to the right further as years have gone on. But I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at all the euphoria and everybody on Twitter. I'm like, guys, you're all idiots. You might be correct, but the probabilities aren't what you think they are. First of all, I've been through enough Republican and Democratic conventions in the U.S. to know that polling numbers are always higher for whatever side just had their convention. This has always been the case. Second, like I said, a person I often go to when I want a more neutral outlook on things, even though a lot of people accuse him of not being neutral, that's fine. It's Peter Zeihan again. And again, I don't agree with everything he says, but sometimes he really nails it, and I think he nailed it today. I'm going to link this down below. It's maybe 3 to 5 minute video to where he said, he said in the past that he predicted a Biden landslide victory in the 2024 election, and he's getting a lot of people now saying, oh, have you changed your thoughts on this? And he said, flat out, I just don't know. But here's why I don't know. And he broke it down really well. He said that polls are generally silly. But if you are going to listen to them, you should listen to them more towards like the middle of September. They're a bit more telling. And when it comes down to it, the Electoral College is still a thing. And it made a lot of sense. And this is the type of stuff I look for. So don't forget, that link will be down below in the show notes if you want to see it later. But the main objective here is to illustrate, in my opinion, how, there's a lot of people who listen to this podcast who also lean right. Or if they were in the United States, they would lean right. And it's been rough for a while. Not only did it seem like things weren't going your way, but the future looked really, really bleak. And it even de-evolved into a lot of doomerism. And I've said this before on my blog. I said this 2 episodes ago. Doomerism is generally for people who are actual lunatics at worst and half-witted at best. It's not helpful. It's not productive. And most of the time, it's just plain fucking wrong. Now, I will say, because I also run a financial prepping podcast, that the one positive that comes out of this type of sentiment is it does push people to act to where they may have been too complacent and lazy to do so otherwise. It's kind of like meme coins. Meme coins are also for half-wits. But if there is one redeeming quality, and you guys have convinced me of this, is it did get a lot of people into crypto that normally wouldn't have gotten there. So I'll give it that. But at the end of the day, all of these extreme predictions are wrong. And all these extreme swings in sentiment are misguided. Contrarians, have the crypto markets taught you nothing? I already knew a lot of this from being a trader for a long time, but there's 3 very obvious takeaways that you can glean from the crypto market. 1, massive doom is always misguided. 2, massive euphoria is equally misguided. And 3, this misguidedness repeats itself over and over, which shows that people just don't learn. And you can transfer this over into real life too. Life is cyclical. Pendulums do swing back and forth. To sit there and say the pendulum's going to swing one way and then just get stuck and stay there is ridiculous, because it never happens that way. Let's throw out some examples. Throughout the late 60s and most of the 70s, everybody thought we were going to nuclear war. Some people were absolutely certain of it. It never happened. All throughout the 80s and 90s, we had all of these doomer climate change predictions when it came to the ozone layer and ocean levels rising and all this type of stuff, and absolutely none of those things actually happened. But a lot of people were dead convinced that they were going to. Now, some of you might be sitting back saying, LOL, stupid liberals. No. You guys are every bit as bad. Let's go over all the doom narratives in the conservative financial market, in the gold and Bitcoin and alternative media community. You guys remember how ESG was going to take over? And there was no way to fight it? And we were going to have carbon scores on our credit cards, and if it was too high, we weren't going to be able to travel or buy stuff. Could this still happen one day? Sure, anything's possible, but it's funny how nobody's talking about it now. And a lot more people were talking about it years ago. Again, I'm not declaring victory on any of these things, but it's funny how that's no longer the narrative. Remember Klaus Schwab's manifesto? Said by 2030, a lot of us will be eating bugs. We will own nothing and be happy. That's spooked a lot of people. And they really did think an unelected man who ran an NGO had this much power. To where nowadays, in the middle of 2024, Klaus Schwab is mostly a meme. And we're not seeing any of those policies take real effect. There may be attempts. There's always going to be attempts. But very little impact so far. Then, the World Economic Forum was going to control everybody by the use of a central bank digital currency. And while this is probably still going to be tried in Europe, it's almost as good as dead in the United States now, because nobody wants it, nobody asked for it, and the people who were in support of this have come to a very rude awakening. And that rude awakening is that they can't just enact all of these policies without consequence. They thought they could. But the world does push back sometimes. And it doesn't have to be violently. You guys know I listen to John Polomny and his podcast. And he says this a lot, and I've always disagreed with it. He says you simply cannot vote your way out of this. And what he's really saying when he says this is that in order to make a change, you are, at the end of the day, going to have to REVOLT, or else nothing's going to change, and a lot of these doomer predictions are going to come true. Which to me is not realistic. The only reason people ever do that is if they're literally starving. And the West has a long way to go before that actually happens. But it doesn't need to be messy like that. You can only get away with so much ridiculousness before the world pushes back. We saw this with the elections in Europe. We saw this with the large sentiment swing we've seen in the United States. We saw this in crypto markets. Another big doomer prediction is that the United States was never going to allow crypto to do the things it needed to do. It was going to shut it down at every turn. Well, crypto pushed back. Turns out there's a whole lot of money in the crypto space. And with money comes political clout. And the anti-crypto army was not ready for that. They tried to pass laws that either nobody gave a shit about, which was most people, or people just hated. There was no support, but they tried to pass them anyway. And that's a real scary thing when you think people have that type of power. But they tried, and they were succeeding for a while until the world pushed back. Now it's looking like any anti-crypto legislation in the United States is going to be very, very hard to pull off going forward. So my overall point here is twofold. One, doomerism is stupid. It's misguided, and it's almost always wrong. But my other point is this. Right now, we're seeing the pendulum swing the other way, and it feels good. And it seems like in a lot of ways we're out of the woods. We are not. The pendulum only stays on our side for X amount of time as well. I always keep thinking of two things while all this is going on. I think of the Homer Simpson meme where Homer's talking to Bart, and Bart will say something like, okay, so for the context of what we're talking about, Bart might say something like, hey, it's great, Homer, anti-crypto legislation is finally dead. And Homer will put his index finger up in the air and say, anti-crypto legislation is dead for now. And I love that meme for that reason. It really illustrates the point. Don't get too down, but at the same time, don't get too excited. I think a while back on this podcast, I told you guys I don't know what it's called, a parable, about the Chinese farmer. If you don't remember it, I'll say it again. So there's this Chinese farmer whose horse ran away, and his neighbor comes down and says, oh, that was your only horse, and it just ran away. That really sucks, doesn't it? And the Chinese farmer responded, maybe. So then a week later, the horse returns, and it brings 6 other wild horses with him. So now the farmer went from 1 to 0 to now 7 horses. And his neighbor sees this and comes down and says, oh, wow, look at that. It turned out to be really good after all. Now you have 7 horses in your employ. That's great, isn't it? And then the Chinese farmer responded, maybe. So a week later, the Chinese farmer's only son is trying to break in these wild horses and ends up shattering his leg. And then the neighbor sees this and comes by and says, oh man, that's your only son. And now he's going to have a hard time working from this point forward. That really sucks, doesn't it? And the Chinese farmer said what he always says. He says, maybe. And then a week later, the Chinese army comes by looking for conscripts for the war. And they try to get the Chinese farmer's only son to sign up, but obviously he couldn't fight because he had a busted leg. And so at the very end, his neighbor comes down and says, well, I guess it all turned out to be a really good thing. Now your son doesn't have to go to the army, where he's probably going to die in a horrible war. That's got to be good news, right? And the Chinese farmer sat back and he said, maybe. So on the euphoria side, it's like I said before here on the podcast, if you take a win, that's great. You got to win. But you only get 1 glass of champagne. You don't get to have the whole bottle. And in truth, you may never get to have the whole bottle. That's just how markets are. That's just how life is. So never let doom take you in the wrong direction. And at the same time, never let euphoria take you in the wrong direction either. It's no different than markets. It's no different than trading psychology. It's just that sometimes we don't always think of it that way. But it's all the same. So if we can't use doom or euphoria to help guide our way into making decisions, what do we have? What should we use? Because it seems like doom and or euphoria is all that's out there. Well, no, there's a lot more. And there's things we use here on the podcast that I think are extremely helpful. And I would much rather follow these things than I would actual sentiment, especially on the extreme ends. I personally always do my best to follow things like hard facts. data, history in order to determine probability. At the end of the day, that's all you can do. And understand this probability is going to be wrong sometimes. It's not going to be 100% probability, which always leaves room for failure. I think a really good example is something I heard today. People were you guys remember this? When Biden first got elected, people were so bullish on marijuana stocks because the Dems were going to decriminalize marijuana all across the country. That's going to be great for these stocks, and they were going to go crazy. Turns out the Democrat did get elected, but in 4 years of what has been a pretty extraordinary bull market, almost all of those marijuana stocks tanked. Now, you can argue there was a lot of data that people were ignoring, and you would be right. But I would say it was a pretty safe bet that the probability was positive, and the probability was there, and it just turned out to be wrong. But if you play strong probabilities, and you mix that with the asymmetry that we use here, which we spoke about last week, good things can happen. Good things have already happened in our world. And if you want to add a little bit of emotion and have some type of conviction behind it, it's okay to have a little bit. Everybody has some. The early Bitcoiners had it, and they were right. They didn't have a whole lot to base it on, really, but they turned out to be right. I have a strong conviction on Web3 gaming. I have absolutely no precedent for this. My main base case here is I can just see this scenario playing out in my head, which is a weak and stupid base case. But when I do factor in facts and data and the little bit of history I do have to go on, I think the probability is there regardless. So I simply think this is a better alternative, and it really does involve stepping back away from all this madness, which, as we said a couple weeks ago, is only going to get worse. But understand, too, that just because things seem to be all right now, and a lot of the things we worried about don't seem to have a high chance of happening now, you still need to be prepping for a couple reasons. One, we have a lot of facts, data, and history to show a high probability of a recession coming quite soon. And if anything, ESG might be all but dead. Klaus Schwab has been rendered irrelevant, and Bitcoin has a clear path to full adoption in the largest and most well-capitalized country in the world. All of those things appear to be true. For now. Maybe. Stay frosty, contrarians. We'll see you next week.